All right, welcome everybody to the Vermont Ag Water Quality Partnerships Lunch and Learn Conservation Webinar Series. We are excited to be celebrating Wetlands Month with a webinar by Jim Eikenberry of NRCS focused on wetland restoration, how to spot potential wetland restoration sites, and all of the opportunities that are available for programming and support to navigate that good work. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind folks about our collective partnerships vision, which is that Vermont will be populated by farms that are vibrant, robust, and sustainable, and that they steward their land to improve water quality as well as wildlife habitat for the benefit of farms, connected ecosystems, the public, and general good of Vermont. Our purpose and mission is that we're working together to improve ag water quality by coordinating education, technical, and financial assistance to the farming community. And we have three overarching goals. One is to improve water quality and wildlife habitat on all farmland owner or operators' properties, to deliver technical and financial assistance in a way that's efficient and effective, and in doing so, provide the best service experience possible for the landowner. So thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim.
Great. Thanks, Allie. I'm going to share my screen here and we'll just confirm that things are working and we'll go for it. How are we doing?
Looks great.
Awesome. Great. We'll go ahead and go for it. So thanks everyone for being here for this talk. May is Wetlands Month. I am Jim Eikenberry. I'm the wetland specialist for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Vermont. So it's one of my most favorite months of all. It's also super busy, so I do appreciate folks making time. This is the only day that I'm not in the field this week to make time for this presentation. I've got a split screen situation here, so if you see just the side of my head, apologies there, but I've got the other screen that I'm looking at. So what we're going to go over today is wetlands restoration, site identification, a lot of emphasis on that, and then getting into some of the different restoration programs that we have here in Vermont. I'll do some particular emphasis on our USDA NRCS programs, but also highlight the vast array of other programs that have come out there, which is pretty exciting, all the stuff that's happening these days. So going back in time a little bit for the USDA NRCS, we used to be the Soil Erosion Service, then the Soil Conservation Service, and we're born out of the Dust Bowl era. And now we're the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we do private lands conservation all throughout the nation and territories. And we're in pretty much every county nationwide, and we do great work, and it varies depending on the part of the nation that we're in. Our overarching driving purpose is helping people help the land. And so when you think about wetlands restoration, that is part of one of the ways that we help people help the land, and also part of our overarching, climate smart agricultural practices. Sometimes that is involving wetland restoration itself. And so if you don't know who we are, that's a quick overview of NRCS, and feel free to be in touch with me with any other questions on who we are and what we do. So why do we need to talk about wetland restoration in the first place? It's because we've had wetlands loss. Nationwide, millions of acres of wetlands were converted over the past few hundred years. And a lot of that conversion, and you look at this slide, for the period of 1780 to 1980, was related to clearing land so that folks could grow food and crops or have land for their grazing animals. Some shocking numbers when you look at percentages. California and then the Midwest, when you look at Iowa, just high 80s, high 90s, just tons and tons of wetlands were converted for agricultural land, and a great deal of that land is still providing food and crops to this day. Here in Vermont, we had wetlands loss that was about 35% is the estimate. That's 121,000 acres. So we're not a huge state, but that's a lot of acreage that was lost. And here's an example of some of the equipment that was used at the time to do that. These are from actual old Vermont photos that were taken at a time when the Soil Conservation Service had sent people around to take photos of what different conservation practices were. And at the time, a lot of that involved wetlands drainage. We were trying to grow as much food as we could for the nation at the time. Those were the goals, and goals have shifted since then. So there is a lot of land in Vermont that was wetland at one point in time and was drained, oftentimes with federal assistance, and is still, land to this day that is being used to grow food and crops. Not all of that is as productive as it used to be, depending on, how much it floods at that site or how well they've maintained the drainage, but there's still a large amount of cropland, especially in Vermont and hayland, that was wetland and has been drained. This is another of the historic photos that always just blows my mind, because sites like this were just mind-bogglingly wet, but they still had equipment where they could get in there. And this is in 1945 with this drag line, and they would just get in there and just find a way to get those mucky soils drained, get an outlet, and then find a way to get in there and farm. So how to identify a potential wetlands restoration site? If you didn't have the benefit of being somebody who was alive at that time during the wetland drainage, as these folks in the photo were, and the other photos, then we need other tools to help understand, how do I know if this site used to be a wetland and is a good location for potential wetlands restoration? So I highly recommend the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources ANR Atlas. It is free. It has the most current publicly available GIS information for the state of Vermont through the partnership with Vermont Center for Geographic Information and the Agency of Natural Resources. There's just, if you want some current information, that's where it's hosted. Especially if you're in a smaller organization, you don't have the ability to have your own geographic information systems and to pay for the license fees, or to have somebody who's a GIS specialist. It's a lot to know and to do to maintain all the geospatial data. But here's a website where it's all there available for you and very conveniently organized, and you can quickly find out what you're looking for. So if you fall into that category, you don't have your own GIS systems, I recommend going to the ANR Atlas, and very quickly you can zoom in, find what you're looking for, turn on the appropriate data layers, and then start to see if you've got a potential wetland restoration project. So what we're going to go through next is just some slides looking at what somebody would do if they're sort of in anywhere in Vermont, and what layers you might want to turn on to look at the potential area that you're interested in. Right after that, we'll also look for a site in the Lake Champlain Basin where there is more data available specifically for wetland restoration targeting. So the first thing you really want to look at is just, that ortho imagery, that aerial photo that is in the background. If you've got land in mind, a landowner has called you and expressed interest, or you just as an organization want to do wetlands restoration and get involved, and you know where your territory is, and you just start looking around, there's no harm in just starting with the aerial photo. The timing of the aerial photo will be very important to know, because it can tell you if it's during November or during July or during May, and that'll be important information when you think about wetlands restoration. When we think about wetlands hydrology, it matters really most how wet that area is during the growing season. So really, not that long ago, that last week of April for most of Vermont is when the growing season starts from a biological standpoint. We're talking about the soil, and then, through into September. When we think about wetlands hydrology, the month of May, because it's wetlands month, there's a reason for it. It's a particularly critical month. This is typically the month where you can go out, and if it's normal weather as far as precipitation goes, you can actually directly observe wetlands hydrology, which you really can't do as much, at the end of August where things have dried up. So in May, you can go out and witness, wow, this site is saturated, it's flooded. And if you meet other criteria, then that can help you know if you've actually got a wetland. If you have aerial photography and it's from the month of May, and then you see, some impressive flooding like we do in this image here, then that could be really helpful. Think, wow, every April and every May, this site is flooded. let's see, if there's other factors that, would make it a wetland. So you need to have wetlands hydrology to be a wetland. You need to have hydric soils or wetland soils. Then you need to have wetlands vegetation or hydrophytic vegetation. So this site here is along the Otter Creek, and we are in the town of Cornwall here in Salisbury there. And as we can tell here, these sites are basically hayfield with some cornfields over there, and they flood. We went kayaking out at these sites to get to an area where tree planting is needed at this easement here. And there was a foot of water on it, a week and a half ago. So it's a wet location. And those aerial photos will help you to identify that. Another thing that's super helpful is turning on that rivers and streams layer in the ANR Atlas. We immediately see some things here that maybe weren't obvious at first. There's an extensive ditch network. When you look at the middle of the slide here, you see all these straight lines and all these right angles. That was the ditch network that's in place that was, set up to drain that site. So because somebody spent all that time, effort, money to put in an extensive ditch network, that's telling you something about that land, that it was wet and they wanted to make it less wet so they could, farm it profitably. Then if you add your hydric soils layer on, now you're really getting somewhere. You've got flooding showing up in that ortho imagery. You've got an extensive ditch network showing up in the rivers and streams layer. And then you've added your hydric soils layer, and it's boom, straightforward. It's basically saying, hey, some SCS or NRCS soil scientists mapped this area. They identified it for the most part around here as hydric soils. It looks like we have some non-hydric soils along the Otter Creek itself, which is what you'd expect because the heavier soil particles drop out earlier during a flood. So that's going to be a little bit sandier there. And so this is starting to get really straightforward. We've got hydric soils, we've got ditches. It looks flooded in the photo, probably a wetland. Looks like it's got some potential for restoration. Additional data kind of supporting this hypothesis, is the mapped wetlands layer. Sometimes the mapped wetlands layer does not include agricultural areas that are in fact wetlands or were wetlands. So that's a caveat there. But it's oftentimes a very helpful layer, and it just becomes additive at a certain point where you're like, yeah, this is looking like a site that might make sense for, targeting wetland restoration, seeing if a landowner is interested. If you are looking for project areas in the Lake Champlain Basin, which is a significant portion of the state of Vermont, then you could skip all of those steps if you wanted to, and just go right over here to the watershed management layer and then scroll down, go to wetland restoration potential, Lake Champlain 2017, which is an update from a prior geospatial layer. And it looked at all those factors that we've been talking about, plus also slope and a few other factors relating to, alluvial soils and flooding and some other good stuff. And then there was a GIS process, and then there was a ranking. And so you see the site that we were just looking at and the sites just to the south of that were all showing up as in very bright red, and the highest targeted areas, for potential wetlands restoration. And then as you go down the spectrum to the more orange or yellow into green, those are sites that could be potential wetland restoration sites, but aren't necessarily as likely to be as great as the ones that are in red. For some of these, depending on your level of access, there are additional project packets that were drawn up by the consultants that would even walk through, hey, for these particular targeted sites, we've identified wetland restoration potential, and even said what we think that wetland restoration should look like. So if you are in the Lake Champlain Basin program, in the Lake Champlain Basin, then you can be in touch with the Vermont Wetlands Program to see if you could get access to some of those project packets and to see what a potential restoration project might look like at a more developed level for that particular site. This is particularly convenient if you're just trying to do a very quick screening and to just understand, this person called me, they said they're interested in wetlands restoration. Does this make any sense on their land? Again, if you're outside of the basin, you can use those other data layers we talked about, and they will help you out. If you get to a situation where somebody says, hey, my land is really wet, but when you look at it, you're not really seeing anything, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't wetland out there. It would just really would mean you'd want to get a site visit out there to see things and to learn more. But from a GIS standpoint, this would be a great way to go. All right. Other ways to identify potential restoration sites. And we went over this a little bit last year, but I know that, we might not have the same audience as we did last year. If you have old aerial photography, either from the landowner or going to your local USDA, NRCS, FSA service center and having access to that, you can start to see some patterns. We've got the 1942 aerial on the left and the 1994 on the right. And you can see that there was some very significant drainage activities that happened out here as they tried to make the site drier. So that can be very helpful information, and also helpful information if you think about where you want to work to target restoring the site. We increasingly have more information available from lower level aerial imagery. In the past, there's been a lot of great aerial photography work done, especially for the rivers program. With the state of Vermont, after flooding, oftentimes they would get, pilots who would be willing to fly them and they would be able to take photos of flooding. The UAVs, the drones that are out there now really just greatly increase the amount of, of availability to really see land from this perspective at a much lower cost than having a professionally licensed pilot, do a flight. So, I will do a plug for the UAV program that the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts have. They are partnering with us here at NRCS to assist us with lots of different ways of inventorying land, doing engineering assistance, and really helping a lot with our wetlands restoration work, understanding before and after elevation surveys. So, if you're starting to get into wetlands restoration, don't be afraid to look at somebody who has a UAV that might be able to help you assist and look at land from a different perspective that we can't always see walking around. On the right of this slide, you'll see what is not the best corn ground in Rutland County. And this is a site that eventually became a wetland restoration project. But if you're out in the field, if you haven't even done the GIS inventory, but you're out in the field walking with a landowner and you start to see patterns on the land that are starting to tell you something, then you could be looking at a potential wetland restoration site. And one of them is just chronically short corn, where there's huge patches that are growing cattails instead of corn, or the corn everywhere else in the county is 8 feet tall. And at this site, it's only 2 feet tall. That can be really useful information to help you understand what's going on out there potentially. Other things to look for, maybe it's stating the obvious, but if there's a ditch and it is actively still draining the site, then that's pretty straightforward. There are plenty of ditches in non-wetland situations, but there's a whole lot more in situations that are wetlands or wetlands and riparian areas connected to one another. This is sort of our classic Otter Creek ditch. This is an older one that wasn't maintained for decades, but it was still very effective, 2 to 3 feet deep in some locations. That's enough to significantly lower that water table and impact the wetland function out there. Another thing that's really common along many of our rivers and streams in Vermont is a total lack of riparian forest. This site, it's an upland, then just a hair downslope to the right of this photo is a wetland. And, that whole site is one that is now also an easement and is getting reforested. But if you're an organization that isn't necessarily thinking about doing massive amounts of hydrology restoration, but there's a niche for you to do vegetation restoration, then there's still great potential to do great work to help do vegetation restoration along riparian areas and the associated connected wetlands. So I want to talk a little bit about our USDA NRCS program that focuses on wetland restoration. And then I'm going to talk about some other agencies and organizations programs as well. And if there's a theme here, it really is that the landowner's goals and objectives will drive what program might be the best fit for them. And Some folks, it's a great fit for them for our easement program. And other folks, it's not a great fit. And in private lands conservation, this is all voluntary. And so it's all about finding what works best for the landowner. So we have the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program Wetland Reserve Easement, and we call it ACEP-WRE because that's a lot easier to say. Oftentimes I'm talking to landowners, they just say, we have a wetland easement program, and then we talk about what an easement is, which we think about land ownership. It's like having a bundle of sticks. And then if you work with somebody to do an easement, then you're selling some of the sticks in your bundle, but you're holding on to other sticks in that bundle. So if somebody participates us in the program, the sticks that they're selling, which are the rights that they're selling, are the right to develop the land, the right to use the land for agricultural purposes, and the right to manage vegetation on the land and river channel management rights and a few other things like that. But those are the top ones. And they're retaining several rights. They still own the land. They still have the right to pay taxes on the land, which I'm sure some people would love to give up, but that's not something that the USDA is going to do for them. They have the right to quiet enjoyment of the land. They have the right to post the land if they want to. There's no public access required in our conservation easement program, which is a question that comes up a lot. On the technical side, what kind of land are we looking for? We're looking for land that was wetland and it was hydrologically manipulated. So it was ditched, it was tile drained, it was land smoothed, it was somehow altered in a way that the hydrology was altered. And it was done before that 12/23/85 date, so it wasn't a Food Security Act violation. So those sites from the 1940s and even anything up to 84 would fit. We're also looking for riparian areas that connect in there to, make it a logical chunk of land that can be great for wildlife habitat. Connecting uplands are also good too, though we don't add too much in the program because we're not trying to take good land out of agriculture, but we do love having upland areas where, a lot of the species that use wetlands, especially if they breed in the wetlands, they have oftentimes a significant part of their life cycle is happening in the uplands as well. So for them to really have great habitat, they need uplands and wetlands, and then intact wetlands as well can be all wrapped in. And they're all site specific, and we figured out working with the landowner and other technical experts to see what would be best out there. For the most part, this is my caveat here, because it is possible to do a 30-year easement for us. But for the most part here in Vermont, we do permanent conservation easements. It's because it's frankly financially more beneficial for the landowner. And when they look at their different options, they choose the permanent conservation easement. In the situation where we're doing a permanent conservation easement, NRCS holds that easement, and we're responsible for the wetlands restoration and easement monitoring in perpetuity. So that's a big old commitment forever. And we are going to be making sure that we're maximizing that site for wildlife habitat. And in the situation where it's a permanent conservation easement, NRCS is paying 100% of the acquisition and restoration costs, which is very significant. Even just getting a professional surveyor out there to do the boundary survey is very expensive. And then we put all of our staff time in, along with our partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to come up with the restoration design, survey permitting, and then hiring contractors to do the work. We just take that burden off of the landowner and we take care of it, and we help to achieve their restoration goals and objectives. So it's a great program. I love it. It gives me great joy to be a part of it. And it's not the right fit for everyone. For some folks, they might not want to be involved in a permanent commitment on the land. They might want to have something different out there. Some folks, they might feel like they've got a small site and it's never going to rank out because they know that the sites that are bigger, that have more hydrology restoration, are going to rank out. And so, we want to think about, what else might fit for them. And we'll get to that in just another slide. Tooting our own horn here a little bit. We're very proud of all of our wetland easement work, and it's been 25 years of ongoing work that I'm the current one, kind of holding on to this legacy and moving it forward until I pass it on to the next person sometime in the future. But the Otter Creek, it's our longest in-state river, and it has a very large drainage area starting at the northern part of Bennington County, going through Rutland and into Addison, and then out into the lake. We've got this amazing 3,000 acre cluster that we will still be adding to, which I'm excited to say. And Overall, right now, we've got 68 of our old WRP and current WRE easements, just over 5,000 acres. And a lot of them are clustered here in this area that really adds to a lot of the wildlife habitat benefits and the floodwater retention benefits, and just a really great restoration of wetland function down in those areas. So normally I have a partner slide, and I adjusted that a little bit here in this situation to think about not only partners who we work with routinely, because we couldn't do this work without them, either on the outreach side of thing, when I think about the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, the restoration side of thing, especially with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in their acquisition of many of these sites, and when landowners are interested in selling because they don't want to, maybe it was land they didn't love the most anyhow, and they're happy to just have it move on, let it be wildlife habitat, then it becomes available to the public when the Fish and Wildlife Department acquires it, and that is always exciting to me. We've increasingly partnered with Ducks Unlimited, and we can't necessarily be doing things on the same land, but if we find something that isn't a good fit for us, we'll pass it on to them. Vermont Land Trust and TNC, the Nature Conservancy, are also doing some great project on lands where they've got easements. So I'm going to just go through these with a little bit more detail and talk about some of the other programs that are out there in Vermont that really weren't out there at the same level even 5 years ago that they are now. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS wouldn't have a successful wetland restoration program without them here in Vermont. We're very grateful for Chris Smith and Ryan Crean and just all their great work helping us do our work with their technical expertise. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is its own separate thing. They do great private lands conservation work. Katie Kane is someone who I'm sure many of you know, and for all I know, she's either on this call or she's out there getting trees planted today, because we're all getting a lot of work done to get trees planted until the end of May. They can do a 15-year contract with somebody. If the person is interested in a wetlands restoration project and they don't really want to make a long-term commitment, but they're open to like a 15-year contract that says, for these 15 years in this specific location, we're going to do X. And that X might be a tree planting, maybe some small hydrology restoration, maybe putting up wood duck boxes, whatever that is. For somebody who the thought of a permanent conservation easement makes them totally uncomfortable, the thought of the 30-year conservation easement still doesn't sit with them. They don't like it, or they don't like the cost that they might have to bear. Somebody who has land is open to doing something out there, maybe he's willing to pay a small amount towards it, but isn't fired up to get in deep, either financially or contractually. Partners for Fish and Wildlife program would be a great fit. They have the technical expertise, they have some funding available, and they have this vehicle of a 15-year contract that can say, hey, for this period of time, we're going to have this land here be this wildlife habitat. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department has been getting EPA funding through their partners at the Vermont DEC Wetlands Program. They also have their own funding available that's related to guns and ammunition sales and fees that come off of that. So they've got a few different income streams where they can use to acquire wetlands. And sometimes it's acquiring a wetland that's already been restored and maybe is already protected, like our wetland restoration easements. And then those have a lot less value per acre because most of the rights have been sold. So they can acquire that and incorporate that into some existing wildlife management area. But with the new EPA funds, they're also looking for lands to do hydrology restoration and vegetation restoration on, kind of similar to what we would do in our WRE program with NRCS. And where they might be a great fit is a landowner who's like, hey, I've got this land. I kind of don't care about it anymore. My kids don't want it. I want to cash out. And there are folks out there like that. I don't want to deal with an easement. I just want somebody to come in and buy this. And we've worked with plenty of folks like that. And then the Fish and Wildlife Department could be a great fit because they could acquire the land in fee because they have the legal right to own land. And then at that point, they use their staff and their resources and consultants as needed to work through a design and a restoration and a permitting process and get those sites restored. So that's exciting. That's out there. Also similar on the hydrology front, the Ducks Unlimited in the fee program, which is tied to the Clean Water Act with the Army Corps of Engineers and the Vermont Wetlands Program, their permitting process for the Vermont wetland rules. If somebody, say you're V-Trans and you need to fill in a small wetland, well, you've got to pay, a fee to compensate for that. Then that fee goes into the pot for Ducks Unlimited in a targeted, watershed area to then start working towards acquiring land to, permanently protect, either through acquisition or an easement, and then do hydrology and vegetation restoration to make up for those other wetland impacts. So that's another area where somebody might be interested in, maybe they don't like the federal government, but they love Ducks Unlimited. And then they might be open to doing a wetland restoration project through them. So, if somebody is interested in the full-blown hydrology restoration, vegetation, but we're not a good fit for them, and maybe Fish and Wildlife is a good fit for them, it could be Ducks Unlimited is. So that's another, area to maybe shift a landowner if that's what they're interested in. The DC Wetlands Program, they're not necessarily holding easements, but they're facilitating thousands of different things, and they're specifically working with us through a couple of different areas that I'll mention. One is through an incentive payment that goes on top of some of our additional payments for our wetland restoration work through NRCS. And that is huge because oftentimes we can't pay as much per acre as somebody really want, but that incentive payment could really put them over the edge and get them so they are motivated to work with us. In the near future, through a regional conservation partnership program grant with NRCS, they're going to be standing up, easement program itself to be targeting some smaller wetland restoration sites that have a lot of ecological and frankly water quality restoration value, but don't rank out as great in our ACEP WRE program because our ranking is geared towards larger sites with larger hydrology restoration because per law that's how that, those points need to be weighted in our ranking. So I hope that in the next year or so, that program is going to get really stood up to the level that we want it to. And there'll be opportunities for folks who might have smaller projects, but looking at, different levels of protection, either just practices or even, easement work to, do that protection there. Vermont Association of Conservation Districts has gotten funding from different sources, and local districts are involved as well to not only do some great outreach, which has been really helpful and appreciated, but also then identifying locations in their targeted areas for restoration and then shifting people to the right location. If folks want to do hydrology restoration, they might go to a different location and not be covered by VACD or the local district. But if somebody's looking just to do tree plantings, that's a great fit for either VACD or the local district. And a lot of great work has been happening there, and it's going to be happening even more the next couple of years. The Vermont Land Trust has increasingly in the past, I'd say 3-4 years, Alaire Diamond and Liz Thompson and all the other great folks out there, Tyler, everybody, have been doing some amazing work on existing easements that they have, putting on additional levels of easement protection, and then within those new riparian corridor protection areas and wetland protection zones, doing wetland restoration, doing riparian area restoration, and just adding value to the easement and adding water quality benefit to the easement, but still keeping it within the fold of the Vermont Land Trust so it doesn't add extra layers of complexity for their easement monitoring. That's been a really exciting area, and I'm excited for them to keep growing in that. And they've done some really great public relations related to it. If you haven't seen it on Facebook or other places on social media, I'd recommend you check it out. So they're doing great work. The Nature Conservancy on their different properties has been very involved in wetland restoration, and they're increasingly at one site in southwestern Vermont going to be really taking it to the next level and improving their wetland restoration and riparian restoration out there. And they've definitely been involved with technical assistance to all these other folks, Vermont Land Trust and us at times with their expertise and knowledge. So, Vermont's a small state. We've got a lot of great partners. We all work together. And so if you've got a landowner who's interested in some way in this, there'll be a way to get them there. So I'm going to wrap this thought up in just a smidge here. I'm going to make sure we've got time for questions, but just think about best practices when you're working with folks and you want to see, is there potential for wetlands restoration? If you haven't met the landowner yet, you're just doing a GIS review, you can look at the stuff that we talked about earlier today. And if nothing is showing up, no mapped wetlands, no hydric soils, nothing that looks like there's a lot of ditches out there, then it might not be a great site for wetlands restoration. or it could be that the offsite data isn't accurate out there and an on-site evaluation is needed. But that GIS review usually can help narrow down where it might be a great spot and where it might not. And then it's all about working with the landowner. And, for NRCS, we have our 9-step conservation planning process. And it's listening to them, understanding what their goals are for their land. And it can be as simple as like visually how they want it to look. Because I've had wetland restoration projects that died because it didn't meet the goals of how somebody wanted it to look, which is fine. You just want to figure that out early in the conservation planning process. You don't want to get far and then realize they don't like the idea of it looking all grown up with brush in there. You want to know early on and then kind of give them the right direction to go to see what would fit their needs. Site visits to look for constraints. If you're doing hydrology restoration, you cannot flood out the neighbors. You need to look at other, factors. Maybe there's an existing easement there that limits what you can do. Get all that stuff sorted out. And, as I talked about before, understand what their preferences are. Would they be interested in a permanent easement? Or are they maybe only open to a 15-year contract? Maybe they don't want any contracts at all, but they're okay if you plant some trees and shrubs out there. Maybe they want the full-blown hydrology and restoration. Maybe they're okay with an easement. Maybe they just don't want to own the land anymore. They want somebody else to own it. All of these things kind of mix together and help you figure out what the right program might be for somebody and, what's the right fit for them. Because in the end, we want to help them meet their conservation goals. And it's okay if it's not WRE, because maybe it's going to be, another program, another project, or maybe you got out there and you thought, oh, it's going to be great for wetlands, but you check the soils and it's high and dry. And maybe it's a great site for a crepe buffer. So there's always a way to, if they've got conservation goals, we can find a program that fits for them. Let's see. And then if you get to a site where everything is sort of clicking, then you want to, have some other folks come out. It could be me, it could be Ryan Crean, it could be a whole range of folks to come out. But if it's looking like a good project, then start to get the folks who have some more expertise, either in the programs or in just wetland identification than you. And then you can bridge the gap and get them to that landowner and then start seeing if a good project can come of it. So I'm just going to go through a couple more slides real quick. Then I'm going to leave a good amount of time for questions. We just want to talk a little bit about, okay, well, we've gone through this whole process, identified objectives. What happens next if we've got a great project? That's where you need people with the right experience to get in there and start working at elevation survey and design and permitting. If you're doing hydrology restoration, if it's tree and shrub establishment that you're looking at, you really need to be looking at the soils. You need to be looking at the flooding regimes or just the saturation regimes. And think about, well, what plants would grow here and are they early successional? Because if you plant something that's a little bit later, it might not make it in the rough conditions. You might need to do site preparation to get a site ready for tree planting. And that could be plowing, that could be herbicide work, that could be mowing, could be a lot of different things. But whatever you're going to do, just getting all the ducks in a row so that when things do get installed, it's going to meet those landowner goals and meet your program goals. So on the wetland restoration side of things for WRE, I've got a few slides here. We're looking at, really undoing what had been done out there, plugging the ditches, breaking tile drainage, taking areas that had been, land leveled and giving them pit mound topography or large oxbows, depending on where you are in the landscape and what natural unimpacted wetlands, reference wetlands nearby look like. Pardon me. So this is a site right after restoration. You can see we've got a depression in there and then putting a lot of coarse woody debris to help get the site going, both from a habitat structure standpoint and to increase more biological activity at the site. Berm removal is another one that we do on some projects. And we've got at least one queuing up along the La Platte River in the next year or two, and I hope a couple more where we can really start to improve floodplain connectivity, which then is also getting water back to those wetlands that we're looking to restore. So that's another way of, hydrology restoration and just taking down those barriers that were keeping the water from getting to the site from people, ditching the stream or the river back in the day and then berming it up. Tree planting. We're currently working with 3 different contractors to get over, we shifted sites a little bit. So now I can say it's about over 30,000 tree and shrub stems in the ground by May 30th. It has been a lot of work. It continues to be a lot of work. And it's worth it because hydrology restoration for us is essential, and it's not the complete wetland restoration. We're not ringing the bell for wetland restoration until we've really got the habitat structure that we need back. And that oftentimes involves a lot of what we call in the forestry world artificial regeneration, and getting the site planted back and giving those woody plants a chance to reestablish on that site, getting it back to what it used to be as best we can. One of the areas we were looking at before, kind of zoomed in now, it is a ASAP WRE easement in Salisbury, and this is the ditch network before the restoration. And then this is the site afterwards. You can see in the photo some of our wetland depressions that are on the site. And as we are speaking right now, unless they're on lunch break, there is an AmeriCorps crew out at this site diligently planting trees and shrubs to help get that vegetation restoration on track. Another site, this is in Leicester Junction. This is the hayfield and that was ditched, and then the hydrology afterwards. So the transformations out here are dramatic. They're exciting, they're fun. You get great wildlife habitat benefit. Sometimes it's very fast. So this is just after some restoration work was done. And then 35 days later, look at that. That's amazing. You've got some great native wetland vegetation up. It's particularly desired by ducks. You've got the water there. So it's very satisfying to do the wetlands restoration work when everything is dialed in and working the way you want it to. So that was a lot. We talked about how to identify a project, programs that are out there, including our permanent conservation easement program with NRCS through the ASAP WRE, many different partners that are involved doing wetland restoration in Vermont, and then a little bit about what it would look like if you're doing some restoration itself. So at this point, Allie, I will be quiet for a moment, have another sip of water, and then ready to answer questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was excellent, very informative. There is one question in the chat from Myra. She asks, if a land trust does the plan and holds the easement, does NRCS do the monitoring with them of the site?
So if I understand the question correctly, then I will do my best to answer it, and then they can let me know if I did not understand the question correctly. So we have situations where a land trust holds an easement, and it's an agricultural easement. So they've acquired the development rights, but nothing else. And on top of that easement, we were able to put a wetland restoration easement. If that's the scenario you're talking about, and NRCS has an easement on the land that is a WRE easement, then we would go out there and do our wetland easement monitoring. I really can't speak for the land trust in that situation if they would count that as meeting their criteria. Technically, they would subordinate their easement in that situation. It would not ever disappear. So I don't know if that, is the scenario that person's talking about. But if they're talking about a scenario where there is no wetland easement, but a land trust has a land trust easement, then NRCS would not be going out there to do any easement monitoring for them per se, because we don't have any involvement with our funds and it's not an NRCS easement. So I may not have fully understood the question. Feel free for that person to unmute and ask, clarifying questions if I didn't quite get their question answered.
Okay, we have a hand up and a question in the chat. So Chris, why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Allie. Real quick, more of a comment than a question. I'll make it good, kind of 2 points here. Number one, thank you, Jim. I think Jim understated how important NRCS and he is in the coordination of this and their staff and delivering these projects. So, huge kudos to NRCS and the resources that they're able to bring to wetlands throughout Vermont. And then the other plug is that it's all of the folks on this call. We don't do this wetland work really without all of the folks that are listening in, that are in the conservation districts, that are in the other programs and state agencies. We need everybody's help to identify these sites and to work with us on these sites to work with the landowners and introduce us to landowners. So it's a huge team effort. And again, huge kudos to NRCS for heading this up and all of the partners at the table. Thanks again, Jim.
Thanks, Chris.
And I see Travis has his hand up. Did you want to add to that, Travis?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, this is great, Jim. I know you're a rock star, and it was really good to see Chris on there too. And Allie, these are great. This is my first one. Fortunately, I had time today to join in, and it's been really, really good. And I guess I'm wondering, Jim, you showed the Otter Creek easement area, and I know we've made some significant investments there. Over 50-60% of our investments are in that area, and it made me wonder, and maybe Chris and I and others can talk more about this, but I'm just curious from a Vermont state perspective and thinking about those partners that you listed. Are there priority areas or wetlands, different wetland types that are priorities for the partnership to address, as we think about limited resources and really being efficient with our time and energy? And we can talk about this later, but it was just on my mind about what are their priority areas and things that we can invest in moving forward. So anyway,
when I think of prioritization with our partners in mind, we've oftentimes focused, at least over the past decade, on locations where we can really make significant water quality improvements as well, particularly in the Lake Champlain Basin. And so when you look at some of that targeting information that was in that Lake Champlain Basin area, we focused on that. And so that's data that's available. And if something ranked really high, then we would be targeting that. In other parts of the state, it really gets down to what their main resource concerns are. So over in the Connecticut, we're thinking more about nitrogen. And so we'd be thinking more about something that is really connected to either a tributary or on the main stem of the Connecticut that is going to get flooding and then be able to, handle some of the nitrogen that's going to be there, nitrification and everything. We do have a good cluster of easements up in the Northeast Kingdom that I think in particular from a wildlife habitat standpoint, but also frankly for the sediment retention and keeping pollutants out of Lake Memphremagog. They're in targeted areas. If there was a part of the state that we don't have many easements and could do more, I'd say it'd be in some of the tributaries of the Connecticut River. And we've got a couple potential, projects that we are looking at in that area now. But I think for the most part, for the Lake Champlain Basin, we're kind of doing well with the targeting. And hopefully on the eastern side of the state, we can do better.
Awesome. Thanks. Look forward to more discussions on that. So great job.
Thanks, Travis.
And Aaron from VHCB asks, you used the term oxbow, if you heard correctly. Could you please define this?
Sure. And I'll maybe even zip through my slides real quick to see if I can find a good example of it. So rivers meander and they change course over time. And an oxbow is an old meander that has since been abandoned and, filled in at different locations. It might still connect during large flooding events, but it's what we would consider a larger wetland depression that has sort of meander shape to it. It would be based off of something that would have been, nearby where you would see a natural one in the forested wetland that, was a naturally occurring one. So we would, mimic what we're going to do on our site based off of what we see in those other locations. So if it was a smaller stream, it'd be a much smaller depression. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about oxbow, that old cutoff meander.
Hey, real quick, Jim, the origin of the term, just to kind of connect the dots, came from a yoke that they would put on oxen. So
wow.
The shape of an oxbow is a curved kind of arc feature. And so that's where we get the term oxbow. It was over that yoke that they wore on oxen. So it wasn't ever a river term, but actually a term, but that's what it looked like.
There you go. Thanks, Chris. We're getting our cultural history in here too.
That's awesome. Marie, DEC.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Allie, and thanks, Jim. This is great. I just wanted to give people a heads up that there'll be a in-field training like this happening in July. So if folks are interested, on July 12th and 14th, folks down in the Connecticut River Basin are going to be putting on a workshop to get you out in the field and look at these features and try to help people understand when you're actually out there and looking at it, what these features look like and how to evaluate the site for restoration. So you'll be hearing more about that through all sorts of emails, and Allie will make sure you get that information for posting. But I just wanted to give folks a heads up and maybe save the date of the July 12th and 14th that this will be coming at you. Hopefully folks can join in, because both of the wetlands we will visit are prior converted from agricultural fields.
That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, and I look forward to including that in our next newsletter, which will be going out next Wednesday if possible, but certainly when we send the recording and information from this event, later today or this week, I can put a save the date in there. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I hope that I can come. That sounds really great. It's nice to get a chance to get out in the field every once in a while. All right, folks, any more questions? Feel free to put your hand up or type it in the chat. All right, seeing none, I think we can wrap up. I'm posting a link to a quick, probably less than 1 minute survey to please give us some feedback about this Lunch and Learn webinar, and it helps us to plan for future ones. And thank you, Jim. This was excellent. Thank you so much. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart. So I really appreciate you taking the time today to share with us and during Wetlands Month as we celebrate wetlands.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, and happy Wetlands Month.